The phone's shrill cry tore through the 2 in the morning silence, a mechanical sound so alien in the deep quiet of his house that it felt like a physical blow. Dr. Alan West surfaced from a shallow, dreamless sleep, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled for the lamp, flooding the Spartan bedroom in a sterile yellow light. The caller ID read Jed Stone. Alan let out a low groan, the sound swallowed by the thick log walls. A call at this hour from a rancher as old and remote as Jed meant one of 2 things: a calving gone terribly wrong or a predator attack. Both meant a long drive on treacherous roads. He answered with a clipped professional tone. West. Jed's voice was a ragged whisper, frayed by age and terror. Alan, you have got to come. It is my bull. My prize Angus. Something got him. A cougar, Jed? Alan asked, already pulling on his insulated work pants. His mind was a flowchart of cause and effect, a defense mechanism against the exhaustion and the biting cold he knew waited for him outside. Or wolves. No, it is not like anything I ever seen. A pause, then a choked sob escaped his throat. He is torn all to hell, Alan. Just get here. The line went dead. Alan stared at the phone for a moment, a knot of irritation tightening in his gut. He had moved to Sylvan Creek, Montana for the quiet, for the simple, understandable problems of animal husbandry. It was a place where cause and effect were clear. A broken leg was a broken leg. An infection was an infection. The work was his penance, a way to keep his hands and mind busy so they would not drift back to the one problem he could not solve. The one diagnosis he had missed until it was too late. 20 minutes later, the diesel engine of his truck rumbled to life, its headlights cutting a desperate tunnel through the swirling snow. The temperature display on the dash read 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The paved county road gave way to a dirt track, now a solid sheet of ice under a dusting of fresh powder. He drove slowly, methodically, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The world outside his cab was an abyss of black, punctuated only by the skeletal, ice-sheathed forms of cottonwood trees. The isolation was so profound, it felt like being at the bottom of the ocean. As he neared the stone ranch, a single trembling light resolved into the porch lamp of Jed's small house. Beyond it, another set of headlights sliced through the dark. The sheriff's cruiser. Alan parked his truck, the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground sounding unnaturally loud. Sheriff Bill Haskins stood silhouetted against the light, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Evening, Doctor," Haskins said, his voice flat. He was a pragmatist, a man who saw the world in simple, easy-to-file reports. "Wasted trip for you. It is wolves. Damn things coming down from the park again." Alan nodded, his gaze already moving past the sheriff to the dark shape lying in the snow near a shattered section of fence. "Jed called me." The old rancher stood by the carcass, his shoulders slumped. The animal was, as Jed had said, torn to hell. It was a 1,000-pound bull, a creature of immense power, now reduced to a ruin of meat and hide. As Alan knelt, his professional detachment kicked in, pushing aside the grim sight. This was not just a kill. Haskins saw a mess. Alan saw data. The chest cavity was staved in, the ribs shattered by a force that suggested a vehicle collision. The throat was ripped out, a classic predator move. But other things were wrong. Terribly wrong. Amid the savage, ragged tears from claws, there were other marks. Clean. Precise. One incision ran along the brachiocephalicus muscle. laying it bare with an anatomist's precision. Another cut had parted the hide over the vastus lateralis, a perfect window into the quadriceps. The attacker had been understanding the machinery of the thing it was destroying. "This was not just wolves, Bill," Alan said, his voice low. Haskins scoffed. "Look at the tracks. They are everywhere." He gestured with his chin. And there they were, the distinct four-toed prints of a large canine pressed into the snow. But Alan's eyes were drawn to the broken fence post. There in the churned, frozen mud were other prints. They were deeper, pressed into the unyielding earth with impossible force. The shape was chillingly familiar. A large, bare human foot. But it was wrong. The proportions were too long, the arch too high. And in the clearest of the prints, just ahead of the toe impressions, was a single deep puncture mark. The mark of a long, non-retractile claw. Ignoring the sheriff's sigh of impatience, Alan walked back to his truck and retrieved his veterinary field kit. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves. This was his process, his ritual. Order in the face of chaos. He took sterile swabs from the edges of the wounds, collecting saliva. He used a scalpel to take tissue samples from the precise cuts and the ragged tears, placing them in separate labeled vials. Finally, with a pair of forceps, he plucked a small tuft of coarse, steel-gray fur from a splinter on the fence post. "What in God's name are you doing, Alan?" Haskins asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "My job," Alan replied, not looking up. He sealed the last container, trying to understand the cause of death. But as he stared at the impossible footprint, a cold dread seeped through his analytical calm. He was not just looking at a predator. He was looking at a contradiction. The agreement with Jed had been grim but necessary. Alan could not haul the entire 1,000-pound carcass back to his clinic, but he used a winch and a bone saw to load the bull's massive thorax and one of the hindquarters into the bed of his pickup. The drive back was silent, the cab filled with the metallic scent of blood and the sterile chill of the night. Jed had not said a word, just watched him with hollowed-out eyes, a man seeing omens in the ruin of his livelihood. Back in his clinic, Alan cranked the thermostat. The building was his fortress of logic, a world of stainless steel, antiseptic odors, and orderly shelves of pharmaceuticals. It was a stark contrast to the primal butchery that now occupied his main examination table under the glare of surgical lamps. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes, a sound that made the clinic feel less like a sanctuary and more like a besieged outpost. Work was a blessed anesthetic. As he began the necropsy, the world shrank to the field of his focus. Tissue, bone, and the questions they held. He was a surgeon again, an analyst. The bloody reality of the task was subsumed by the cold precision of the process. He dictated his findings into a small digital recorder, his voice a steady clinical monotone that betrayed none of the unease coiling in his stomach. Subject is a male Angus bull, approximate weight 1,100 pounds. Cause of death, massive thoracic trauma and exsanguination. He examined the ribs first. Haskins would have called them shattered. Alan saw something more specific. The breaks were not the splintered, chaotic fractures of a random impact. They were clean, snapped with a terrifying efficiency, as if by a single focused blow of unimaginable kinetic energy. He used a saw to cut a cross-section of a rib, placing it under a digital microscope. The image on the monitor made him pause. The bone's crystalline structure showed stress patterns he had never seen, evidence of a force exceeding anything a cougar or bear could generate. He moved to the muscle tissue. The surgical cuts were even more baffling up close. They were clean, yes, but not made by a blade. Under high magnification, he saw that the muscle fibers at the edge of the cuts had not been sliced. They were separated, pushed apart at a cellular level, as if they had been blasted by a high-frequency vibration, a phenomenon known as cavitation. It was the kind of damage a specialized ultrasonic tool would cause, not teeth or claws. Hours bled together. The wind outside shrieked. Deep in the methodical rhythm of his work, his guard slipped. An image flashed in his mind, a small hospital room, the rhythmic beep of a monitor, and the face of his daughter, pale and small, her body failing in ways the specialists could not explain. The same cold dread he had felt then washed over him now. The feeling of staring at a puzzle where the pieces did not just fail to fit. They belonged to different boxes entirely. He had failed her because he had not seen the pattern in time. He would not make that mistake again. His phone buzzed on the counter. His ex-wife, Sarah. He almost ignored it, but the habit of years was too strong. "Alan, are you okay? I saw you had a missed call." "I am fine, Sarah. Just a late night with a sick animal." His voice was tight, strained. "You sound..." She hesitated. "Like you used to. When you were at the hospital with Lily." The comparison struck him like a physical blow. "I am fine," he repeated, his tone colder this time. "I have to go." He ended the call before she could reply, the silence in the clinic now feeling heavier, more accusatory. He was alone. He had made sure of that. He carefully packaged the best of the samples, the fur, the tissue from the cavitation wounds, the saliva swabs. He addressed the box to his old mentor, Dr. Mark Reynolds, head of comparative pathology at the University of Montana. In the accompanying letter, he deliberately obfuscated. He could not write, "I think a monster with surgical knowledge and superhuman strength killed a bull." He wrote Mark seeing some very anomalous predator activity. Suspect an unknown canine hybrid with extreme jaw strength. The attached fur sample is particularly unusual. Could you run a sequence when you have a moment? He was hedging, protecting his professional credibility. But as he sealed the box, he knew he was not just asking for a genetic analysis. He was asking for absolution, for another scientist to look at the impossible data and tell him he was sane. A month passed. The snows deepened, and the memory of Jedstone's bull faded from the town's collective consciousness, dismissed as a grim but isolated wolf attack. Life in Sylvan Creek settled back into its winter rhythm of quiet endurance. But for Alan, the quiet was a taut wire of anticipation. He was not waiting for an answer from Mark's laboratory. He was waiting for the predator to strike again. His days were routine, but his nights were consumed by a new obsession. He spread topographical maps across his dining room table, marking the location of the Stone Ranch. He scoured online hunting forums and local blogs, searching for any mention of strange tracks or missing livestock. He was a man possessed by a single terrifying hypothesis. He bought a simple wall calendar and circled the date of the bull's death. Then he counted forward. The call came on the 28th day, just after dusk. It was a sheep rancher named McCarthy, his farm located 10 miles from Stones, closer to the foothills of the Sapphire Mountains. His voice was frantic, breathless. Something's in my flock. It is a massacre. When Alan arrived, the scene was a surreal nightmare painted in crimson and white. The setting sun cast long purple shadows across a snow-covered field littered with the mangled carcasses of nearly 24 sheep. The air was still, the silence profound after the chaos of the slaughter. A sense of dreadful déjà vu washed over Alan. He felt less like a veterinarian arriving at a scene, and more like a prophet whose terrible vision had just come true. He pulled the calendar from his truck's glove compartment. He stared at the date, then up at the sky where a full, luminous moon was beginning to rise. A cold, sick feeling churned in his stomach. 28 days. A lunar cycle. He despised the implication, the descent from scientific inquiry into the realm of folklore and B-movies. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But the evidence at his feet screamed otherwise. The signature of the killer was identical. The same impossible, focused strength. The same blend of savage fury and cold, analytical precision. But there was a new, chilling detail. Several of the sheep were not dead. They lay paralyzed, their eyes wide with terror. A single precise bite mark at the base of their skull, severing the spinal cord. The creature was not just a berserker. It was learning. It was refining its hunting techniques. He worked under the beam of his headlamp. The other ranchers keeping their distance, shotguns held tight in their hands. They were forming armed posses, their fear curdling into a grim, angry resolve. To them, Alan was the city-bred veterinarian, the doctor who asked too many questions and provided no simple answers. In the local tavern a few nights later, he overheard the whispers. That veterinarian, West. He was at Stone's place too. Acts like he knows something he is not telling. His isolation was no longer just a personal choice. It was becoming a social quarantine. He was the outsider, the harbinger of a problem no one wanted to understand. Back home, surrounded by his maps, the cold logic of the situation began to assert itself over the superstitious dread. He drew a line between the Stone Ranch and the McCarthy farm. It was a near-perfect vector, pointing directly toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. His finger traced the line further into the foothills until it landed on a small printed name on the topographical chart. Black Fang Mine, abandoned. It was a guess based on 2 points of data. But as he stared at the map, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. Purpose. This thing, whatever it was, had a territory. It had a pattern. And if it had a pattern, it could be found. He picked up a scalpel from his desk, the cold steel familiar in his hand. He compared his notes from the bull with the fresh data from the sheep. The attacker had used overwhelming force on the larger animal, but had switched to a precise, nerve-severing technique for the smaller, more numerous prey. It adapted its tactics based on the size and number of its victims. This was not the blind instinct of a starving animal. It was the calculated methodology of an intelligent hunter. And that, more than the lunar cycle or the impossible strength, was what truly terrified him. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, as a blizzard began to wall in Sylvan Creek. It was from Mark Reynolds. The subject line was a single cryptic word: results. The body of the email was terse. Alan, call me. Encrypted data attached. Key is your daughter's birthday. Mark. Alan's hands felt cold and clumsy as he downloaded the file. Lily's birthday. Mark was a good friend. He knew that using that sequence of numbers was a signal, a way of saying, "This is serious, and it is for your eyes only." He sat in his home office, the only light coming from his computer monitor as the snow-choked world outside faded to gray. The genetic code scrolled onto the screen, a language he understood as well as English. He read it once, then again, then a third time, his scientific mind rebelling, searching for the error, the contamination, the mistake that had to be there. But there was no mistake. The raw data was unequivocal. His world, a carefully constructed edifice of biological law and rational explanation, crumbled into dust. The skepticism he had clung to for a month evaporated, replaced by an icy, profound horror that was both intellectual and primal. It was the same feeling of absolute helplessness he had experienced in that hospital room, the day a doctor had finally handed him a file with Lily's final, incomprehensible diagnosis. It was the terror of facing a biological reality that simply should not be. He dialed Mark's number. "You saw it," Mark said, his voice strained, stripped of its usual academic joviality. "The nuclear deoxyribonucleic acid is a clean match," Alan said, his own voice sounding distant, disconnected. "Canis lupus. A gray wolf. No question. But the mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid," Mark cut in. "Alan, the mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid is 100% human. Homo sapiens. There is no ambiguity. I ran it 3 times. I ran it against every primate database we have. It is human." Alan leaned forward, his head in his hands. He understood the implications better than anyone. Nuclear deoxyribonucleic acid is inherited from both parents, defining the species. But mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid is passed down almost exclusively from the mother. It was like finding a car with the chassis of a wolf but an engine built and registered to a human. 2 separate biological passports existing in a single cell. "It is a contaminant, Mark." "It has to be," Alan said, the words tasting like a lie. "I must have coughed on the sample. A stray skin cell." "You?" Mark's laugh was short and humorless. "Alan, you are the most pedantic, sterile procedure-obsessed veterinarian I have ever met. The chances of you contaminating a sample like that are 0. I checked the fur sample you sent. The root of the hair itself contains both signals. It is not contamination. It is in the organism." There was a long silence on the line. Alan could hear the hum of equipment in Mark's laboratory, a sound of normalcy in a conversation that had veered into the impossible. "There is more," Mark said, his voice dropping lower. "I ran a full sequence. There are markers I have only ever seen in theoretical papers. A gene cluster that would promote rampant accelerated cellular regeneration. Another that would trigger anomalous expression of growth hormones and androgens far beyond any known biological scale. Whatever this thing is, it is not just a hybrid, it is engineered. Or it is a pathology so profound it is rewriting the rules." "What do we do?" Alan asked, the question hanging in the air. "We do nothing," Mark said, his tone firm, decisive. "We bury this. Alan, if you take this to the authorities, they will laugh you out of the state. If by some miracle they believe you, they will send a team of men with rifles, not scientists. This data cannot leave your computer. Erase it. Burn your notes. This is a dead end. It killed a bull, Mark. It slaughtered 24 sheep. And if you go public, you destroy your career and start a panic over a 1 in a billion genetic freak that will be dead by spring. Forget it, Alan. For your own good." The call ended. The connection was severed. Alan stared at the screen, at the lines of code that represented a biological impossibility. Mark had walled himself off behind a fortress of professional denial. He was alone. utterly. He was not dealing with an animal anymore, he realized. He was dealing with a disease, a walking, hunting, intelligent pathology. He closed the file and began a new search, this time in encrypted medical archives and fringe biological databases, looking for keywords. Atavistic resurgence, spontaneous mutation, chimerism. He had to give his monster a name. The news came 3 days later, a brief, sterile report on the local radio station sandwiched between a cattle market update and the weather forecast. A hiker, a tourist from California named Kevin Brolin, had been reported missing. His rental car was found at a trailhead in the foothills of the Bitterroot Range, not far from the Black Fang mine. Search and rescue teams had been deployed, the announcer said, but were being hampered by the recent heavy snowfall. Alan switched off the radio, the silence in his truck suddenly deafening. He sat in his pickup at a scenic overlook, the one he used to visit for peace. The vast, snow-draped valley below, once a symbol of tranquility, now looked like a hunting ground. Vast and hostile. The hiker was dead. Alan knew it with a certainty that settled in his bones like the winter cold. The creature had escalated. From a single powerful bull to a flock of defenseless sheep, and now to a human. The progression was grimly logical. It was testing its limits, expanding its territory, and its preferred prey was now the most dangerous game. A wave of guilt, so powerful it was physically nauseating, washed over him. He knew. For a month he had known something was out there, something unnatural and deadly. He had gathered his data, sent his samples, and waited. He had acted like a scientist when he should have acted like a guardian. His inaction, his professional caution, had just cost a man his life. The memory of Lily rose unbidden, sharp and agonizing. He saw himself at her bedside, holding her small hand, watching the lines on the monitor, surrounded by charts and data that offered no answers, only a clinical record of her decline. He had been a passive observer then, helpless in the face of a biological revolt he could not comprehend. He had failed to protect his own daughter. Now that same horror was playing out on a larger, more monstrous scale, and he was failing again. No more. The thought was a spark in the cold void of his guilt. It was no longer about understanding. It was about stopping it. This was not just a scientific puzzle anymore, it was a matter of atonement. He had to act, not as a hunter seeking a trophy, but as a doctor confronting a disease. You do not reason with a cancer, you cut it out. He would be the surgeon. He started the truck and drove back toward town, his mind a whirlwind of calculation. He could not go to Sheriff Haskins. Bill would demand proof, and showing him the photo from the game camera or the genetic report would get him locked in a padded cell. The story was too fantastic, too insane. He could not tell the ranchers either. Their fear would turn into a mob, a chaotic, indiscriminate hunt that would get more people killed and would certainly destroy any chance of studying the creature. This was his burden to carry alone. He intercepted Haskins at the town's only gas station. The sheriff looked tired, his face etched with the frustration of a fruitless search. "Any luck finding that hiker, Bill?" Alan asked, his voice deliberately casual as he filled his tank. Haskins shook his head. Nothing. It is like he vanished off the face of the earth. We have got teams sweeping the grid from Bear Creek to the old mine road, but with this much snow, it is a needle in a haystack. Alan nodded, filing the information away. The old mine road. They were in the right area, but they did not know what they were looking for. Tough break. Let me know if you need anything. Haskins gave him a weary glance, seeing nothing more than a concerned citizen. Will do, Doctor. Back at his house, Alan walked to the heavy steel safe in his office closet. He spun the combination lock, the clicks loud in the quiet room. Inside, beneath a file of veterinary licenses and property deeds, lay a wooden case. He opened it. A revolver sat nestled in the velvet lining, its stainless steel finish gleaming. His grandfather's gun. He had not touched it in years. He picked it up, the weight of it alien and repellent in his hand. This was a tool of last resort, a blunt instrument for a problem that required a scalpel. This was Plan B. It was the symbol of his own failure if his science was not enough. But first, he would try his own way. He was a veterinarian. His expertise was in managing and controlling large, dangerous biological entities. He would treat this not as a monster to be slain, but as an incredibly aggressive, uniquely dangerous patient. His goal was not to kill. It was to capture. That night, Alan's clinic transformed. The sterile, quiet space of healing became a war room, a staging ground for a one-man field operation. The stainless steel examination tables were no longer for sick pets. They were covered with an array of specialized equipment that reflected the strange duality of his mission. It was an arsenal, but it was a veterinarian's arsenal. For the first time in weeks, the gnawing fear was replaced by a sharp, cold focus. He had a protocol. He had a plan. This was familiar territory. He was a doctor preparing for a complex and dangerous procedure. The patient was just larger, faster, and more likely to tear him limb from limb. The operating theater was the frozen wilderness of the Montana mountains. His primary tool was not a rifle, but a specialized air rifle designed to deliver a tranquilizer dart with precision from a distance. He spent an hour calibrating the optical sight, adjusting the pressure settings. This was the scalpel. The real challenge was the anesthetic. A standard dose of carfentanil or ketamine was a wild guess. The creature's genetic report suggested an abnormally high metabolism and an extreme endocrine system. A normal dose would either have no effect or, worse, only enrage it. He needed something with an immediate, overwhelming central nervous system impact. He settled on a combination he had only ever read about in emergency protocols for large, exotic animals: etorphine hydrochloride, known by its trade name M99, mixed with a potent sedative, xylazine. M99 was 100 times more powerful than morphine, a drug so dangerous that a single drop on human skin could be fatal. It was the nuclear option of animal tranquilizers. He called his medical supplier in Bozeman, his voice calm and professional. "Morning, David. It is Alan West. I have got a situation. A grizzly, trapped in a shed up on a private ranch, and it is getting aggressive. I need to immobilize it, and my usual cocktail is not going to cut it." He used the full weight of his professional reputation, built over 5 years of reliable, no-nonsense service to push the request through. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "M99, Alan? That is heavy stuff. You sure you know what you are doing?" "I would not ask if I was not David," Alan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I need the etorphine, the xylazine, and a full vial of its reversal agent naltrexone. Just in case." The supplier relented. The drugs would be couriered to him by the end of the day. As he waited, he assembled the rest of his kit. A thermal monocular, which would allow him to see heat signatures in the dark. A half-dozen trail cameras to expand his surveillance network around the mine. A heavy-duty industrial respirator with organic vapor cartridges, a precaution for whatever environment he might find inside the mine. Climbing ropes, carabiners, and a harness. Finally, he packed a medical bag, but it was not for him. It was for his patient. It contained intravenous lines, vital monitors, and the naltrexone. He was planning not just for the capture, but for the post-operative care. Late that afternoon, the unmarked courier van delivered a small, heavily insulated case. Inside, cushioned in foam, were the vials. Alan handled the M99 with the reverence and fear a bomb disposal expert affords a live detonator. He began the most critical calculation of all, the dosage. This was the crux of the entire plan. He did not know the target's exact mass. Based on the game camera photo and the force required to kill the bull, he estimated its mass at 300 to 400 pounds in its transformed state. Too little M99, and the creature would barely feel it before it closed the distance and killed him. Too much, and he would overwhelm its system, causing immediate respiratory collapse. He would become its executioner, and the mission, the chance to study, to understand, would be a failure. He decided to prepare 3 separate darts, one dosed for 300 pounds, a second for 350, a third, the maximum he dared, for 400. He would have to make a split-second judgment in the field. He loaded the first dart, the one for 350 pounds, into the tranquilizer rifle. The metal of the dart was cold and clinical. It was a vessel of pure science, aimed at a problem that defied it. The days that followed were a blur of cold, sleepless vigilance. Alan became a ghost in the foothills. He used the daylight hours, when the creature was likely dormant, to methodically expand his web. He drove the labyrinth of old logging roads in his truck, parking in concealed spots and hiking into the dense pine forests. He moved with a quiet purpose, placing his new trail cameras in a strategic perimeter around the Black Fang mine. Each camera was a silent sentinel, an extension of his own senses. His world shrank to the size of his truck's cab and the cold gray landscape outside. The nights were the worst. He would park miles away from the mine, kill the engine, and sit in the crushing silence for hours, sweeping the dark, snow-laden trees with the green and white glow of the thermal monocular. The world through the thermal lens was a place of spectral heat ghosts. He watched deer move like pale flames through the underbrush, their warmth a stark contrast to the deep, cold black of the trees and rocks. He was teaching himself the rhythms of the forest at night, calibrating his eye to spot an anomaly, a heat signature that was too big, too fast, too wrong. He was simultaneously the hunter and the hunted. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind that moaned through the pines, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was running on caffeine, protein bars, and a grim determination that had become an obsession. The memory of the missing hiker was a constant spur, driving him onward. He deliberately avoided town. He had become a subject of local gossip, the reclusive veterinarian who was acting stranger than usual. He saw the suspicious glances when he stopped for gas, the way conversations would halt when he walked into the general store for supplies. They saw a man coming apart. They had no idea he was the only thing holding their fragile peace together. On the third night of his vigil, he found it. Not the creature itself, but its sign. About a mile south of the mine, he discovered a shallow depression in the snow beneath a thick overhang of rock. A nesting spot. The snow was packed down by the weight of a huge body. The air held a faint musky scent, a mix of wet fur and something else, something metallic and sharp. And scattered nearby were the tattered remnants of a nylon parka and a single Gore-Tex hiking boot. The hiker, Kevin Brolin. Alan felt a wave of cold fury, but he pushed it down, converting it into focus. He knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the tracks leading away from the makeshift den. And there they were again, the impossible duality. The deep, four-toed prints of a wolf, side by side with the long, distorted prints of a bare human foot, each one punctuated by that single sharp claw mark. The tracks switched back and forth, a clear record of a creature that could not decide what it was. The discovery galvanized him. He was close. His theory was correct. This was its territory. He spent the next day moving two of his cameras closer, positioning them on the game trails that led directly from the den to the mine entrance. He was no longer casting a wide net. He was tightening the noose. The weight was agonizing. He sat in his truck that night, the thermal monocular pressed to his eye, the tranquilizer rifle resting on the passenger seat. He scanned the landscape until his vision swam. Nothing. The forest was quiet, locked in the deep freeze of the night. Doubt began to creep in. Had it moved on? Had he spooked it? Then his phone, which he had linked to the camera's wireless transmitter, buzzed softly on the dashboard. A motion alert from camera 4. He fumbled for it, his heart pounding. The first image loaded slowly over the weak signal. It was an elk, its head up, ears swiveling, its white-hot body a beacon in the infrared spectrum. The second image, taken a second later, showed the elk in midbolt, a blur of panic. Then the third image loaded. It was indistinct, a smeared shape of motion too fast for the camera's shutter speed. But it was huge, a dark, hot mass moving with incredible velocity through the frame, right where the elk had been. It was there, and it was hunting. Alan's hand went to the rifle. He was on the right path. It was only a matter of time. The alert came just before 3 in the morning a night later. Alan was dozing in the driver's seat of his pickup, parked in a secluded aspen grove 2 miles from the mine. The truck was cold, the engine off for hours to avoid making any sound. The soft, insistent buzz of his phone on the dashboard was like an electric shock. He snatched it up, his breath catching in his throat. The screen read, "Alert. Blackfang Mine Entrance." This was it. The camera he had placed with painstaking care, concealed in a hollow log overlooking the collapsed maw of the old silver mine. This was the heart of the creature's territory. His fingers were stiff with cold as he tapped the notification. The thumbnail was just a dark shape against a gray background. He opened the full-size image, the phone screen seeming to burn in the profound darkness of the cab. For a moment, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Then, the details resolved, and a feeling of cold, absolute triumph mixed with primal terror washed over him. He was not crazy. It was real. The image, captured in the stark black and white of the infrared spectrum, was horrifyingly clear. It was a bipedal creature, standing hunched at the entrance to the mine shaft. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, even with its stooped posture. Its arms were long, dangling almost to its knees, tipped with thick, dark claws. The body was covered in a dense coat of shaggy fur that glowed white with body heat, but the underlying musculature was visible. The powerful shoulders, the thick thighs of a predator built for explosive speed. But the head was the most nightmarish part. It was elongated into a lupine snout, a wolf's head atop a body that was a grotesque parody of a man's. Its posture, the way it stood on two legs, the hint of an opposable thumb on its long-fingered hands, it was all a horrifying mockery of humanity. It was looking away from the camera, preparing to step into the blackness of the mine. Alan stared at the image, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This single photograph was the most important and most dangerous piece of evidence in the world. He had done it. He had captured definitive, undeniable proof of the creature's existence. His first instinct was to send it, to forward it to Mark, to Sheriff Haskins, to a news agency, to show someone, anyone, that he had not been chasing shadows. But he stopped himself. What would this picture accomplish? It would not launch a careful scientific investigation. It would launch a panic. It would bring news helicopters, armed vigilantes, and government agents who would be more interested in a body bag than a blood sample. They would see a monster to be put on a wall, not a biological anomaly to be understood. This photograph was not a key. It was a lit match dropped into a powder keg. This knowledge was his, and his alone. The responsibility that came with it was absolute. He saved the image to a secure folder, then began to meticulously plan his next move. The photograph gave him a crucial piece of tactical information. The creature used the main entrance. The old mine maps he had pulled from the county archives showed the Black Fang was a simple shaft and tunnel system with only one known public entrance. There were ventilation shafts, but they were narrow, vertical, and sealed with grates. For a creature this large, the main tunnel was the only way in or out. He analyzed the photograph with a veterinarian's eye, stripping away the horror and seeing only the physiology. He noted the massive development of the trapezius and deltoid muscles, the elongated limbs suggesting a powerful, loping gait. This was not a supernatural beast. It was a specimen of extreme pathological adaptation. He zoomed in on the creature's torso, estimating its mass. It was leaner than he had thought, more sinew and muscle than bulk, closer to 300 pounds than 400. He made a mental note to use the medium-dose dart first. He had the proof. He had the location. He had the plan. All that was left was to spring the trap. He looked from the terrifying image on his phone to the tranquilizer rifle resting on the seat beside him. The science experiment was over. The field operation was about to begin. The sky was just beginning to bleed from black to a deep bruised purple when Alan put his plan into motion. The pre-dawn hour was the tipping point, the moment of greatest vulnerability for a nocturnal creature seeking its lair before sunrise. He drove the final 2 miles to the mine with his headlights off, navigating by the faint ambient light reflecting off the snow. The truck's engine was a low, guttural rumble in the immense silence of the mountains. He reached the clearing in front of the Black Fang mine. The entrance was a jagged wound in the mountainside, a maw of absolute darkness. He did not hesitate. He swung the heavy-duty pickup around, reversed, and with a final decisive movement, rammed the rear of the truck hard against the rock face, perfectly blocking the lower 2/3 of the entrance. The crunch of the steel bumper against rock was a deafening, profane sound in the morning stillness. He left the engine running, its diesel clatter a deliberate declaration of his presence. The trap was set. Nothing was getting out that way. Adrenaline sang in his veins, a high, sharp note, but his mind remained cold, focused on the protocol he had rehearsed 100 times. He grabbed his climbing gear and the heavy backpack from the truck bed. The next step was the most dangerous. Using the harness and ropes, he began to scale the rock face above the mine entrance. The rock was slick with ice in places, and his gloved hands fumbled for purchase, but he moved with a slow, methodical certainty. 10 feet up, 20. Finally, 30 feet above the blocked entrance, he found it, just where the old maps said it would be. A ventilation shaft, a 2-foot-wide circular opening covered by a rusted iron grate. He anchored his rope and set to work on the grate. The bolts were ancient, fused with rust. He had come prepared. A small, battery-powered angle grinder from his toolkit whined to life, spitting a shower of orange sparks into the pre-dawn gloom. The noise was agonizingly loud, but it was a necessary risk. After a few minutes of high-pitched screaming, the last bolt gave way. He pried the heavy grate open. A wave of cold, stagnant air, smelling of damp earth and something else, the same faint, musky odor from the den wafted out. He was now directly above his target. From his pack he retrieved the final pieces of his elegant, non-lethal weapon. A small, high-pressure air compressor and a canister of medical-grade sevoflurane, a potent inhalation anesthetic used in surgery. It was heavier than air. It would sink, flooding the tunnels below, inducing unconsciousness quickly and relatively safely. He connected the canister to the compressor, ran a hose into the ventilation shaft, and switched it on. The compressor kicked in with a steady thump, 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 pumping the invisible gas down into the darkness. He glanced at his watch, starting a timer. He had calculated the approximate volume of the main tunnels based on the maps. At this flow rate, it would take 15 minutes to reach a sufficient concentration. For a long minute, there was no response. Then, from the depth of the mine, a sound began. It was a low, confused growl that built into a furious, deafening roar of rage and panic. The sound vibrated through the rock under his feet. The creature knew it was trapped. The roaring continued for another minute, a terrifying display of raw power. Then it became a choked, wet cough. Then, abruptly, silence. The gas was working. Alan shut off the compressor, his heart hammering. He remained perched on his ledge, watching the timer on his watch. He had to wait. 45 minutes. That was the window he had calculated. Long enough for a large mammal to enter a deep state of surgical anesthesia. Not so long as to risk fatal respiratory depression. The minutes crawled by, each second stretched taut with tension. The sun was now cresting the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The world was waking up, oblivious to the strange, silent drama playing out on the mountainside. When the timer finally beeped, Alan took a deep, steadying breath. He donned his industrial respirator, checked the seal, and slung the tranquilizer rifle over his shoulder. It was time to go in. It was time to meet his patient. Clipping his safety line, Alan rappelled down the rock face to the ground. He squeezed past the bumper of his truck and stepped into the mouth of the Black Fang mine. The air inside was frigid and heavy with the cloying, faintly sweet smell of sevoflurane. He switched on the powerful flashlight mounted to his rifle, its beam cutting a perfect, unwavering circle through the gloom. He moved cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel floor. He was ready for anything. A cave littered with the bones of prey, a primitive den reeking of blood and filth, the unconscious form of the massive creature he had seen on camera. He was prepared for a monster's lair. What he found shattered all his expectations. This was no cave. The walls of the main tunnel were surprisingly clean. Instead of animal spoor, he saw the scuffed tracks of work boots. Along one wall, thick, insulated electrical cables were neatly fastened with plastic clips running deeper into the darkness. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly wrong that he stopped, his mind struggling to reconcile the evidence of his eyes with the monster he was hunting. He followed the cables, his rifle held at the ready. The tunnel opened into a large excavated chamber, perhaps an old staging area for the miners. And here the scene became even more bewildering. A portable diesel generator, currently silent, sat in one corner. A long workbench stood against the far wall, laden not with animal remains but with scientific equipment. A high-powered microscope, a small centrifuge, racks of test tubes, and several open laptops. Wires snaked from the equipment to a bank of humming batteries. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, custom-built steel cage, large enough to hold a grizzly bear. Its door, made of solid steel bars, had been torn from its hinges and lay twisted on the floor. And lying on the cold stone floor next to the mangled cage was not the 8-foot-tall beast from his camera. It was a man. He was old, in his late 60s, rail-thin, and swallowed by a stained white lab coat. His face was a landscape of deep lines, his hair a wild shock of white. He was unconscious, breathing in slow, shallow rhythm, a victim of Alan's own anesthetic gas. Stunned, Alan lowered his rifle. All his theories, all his carefully constructed plans, evaporated. This was not a lair. It was a laboratory. And a prison. He knelt beside the man, checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady. Alan retrieved a small oxygen mask and tank from his medical pack and fitted it over the man's face. He had to reverse the effects of the gas. As the pure oxygen flowed, the man stirred, groaning. His eyelids fluttered open. They were pale blue, filled with a startling, lucid intelligence. And fear. Who are you? The old man rasped, his voice dry and scratchy. My name is Alan West. I am a veterinarian, Alan said, his mind reeling. I thought you were an animal. The old man pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze falling on the tranquilizer rifle. A look of profound, weary understanding crossed his face. He almost smiled, a grim, humorless twitch of his lips. A common mistake, he said. I am Dr. Elias Vance, and in a way, you are correct. I am an animal. I just was not supposed to be. Alan could only stare. The bull, the sheep. Collateral damage, Vance whispered, his eyes closing for a moment as if in pain. The regrettable results of a failed experiment. My cage. I built it to contain the episodes. The last one. My calculations for the sedative dosage were incorrect. The strength increase was more than I predicted. He gestured a frail hand toward the twisted cage door. He looked back at Alan, his gaze sharp, analytical. You gassed the mine. Sevoflurane, from the smell of it. Clever. An elegant solution. You blocked the entrance with your truck, I presume? You found the vent shaft. You are a methodical man, Dr. West. Vance's story tumbled out. A confession from a man who had not spoken to another human in years. He was not cursed. He was not supernatural. He was sick. He was the sole sufferer of a condition he himself had named: uncontrolled genome restructuring syndrome, a 1 in 7 billion genetic disease, a latent retrovirus in his deoxyribonucleic acid that, when triggered, would hijack his cellular structure, forcing a violent temporary metamorphosis based on an atavistic lupine blueprint buried deep in the human genome. This mine was his self-imposed prison, and the lab where he had devoted his life to studying his own affliction, desperately searching for a cure. He pointed to a stack of leather-bound journals on the workbench. "My life's work," he said. "Decades of data, blood analysis, hormone charts, trigger theories tied to lunar gravity and electromagnetic fields. I was so close to a viable gene therapy." For Alan, it was like discovering the lost notebooks of Darwin, a lifetime of impossible research sitting right in front of him. The monster was a man, a scientist, a patient. Their conversation, a frantic exchange between two scientists across an impossible gulf, was cut short by a sudden, violent tremor that racked Dr. Vance's thin frame. He cried out, a sharp, strangled sound of agony, and collapsed back onto the stone floor. "No. Not now," he gasped, his fingers curling into claws. "The stress, the anesthetic residue, it is forcing a cycle." Alan's medical instincts took over. He knelt beside Vance, his mind racing through differential diagnoses. But what he was witnessing defied every medical textbook he had ever read. This was not a seizure. This was deconstruction. The lab, a moment before a place of stunning revelation, was plunged into a nightmare of biological horror. A low growl rumbled in Vance's chest, and his back arched, the sound of his vertebrae popping and grinding audible even over his pained cries. His skin, pale and thin, seemed to stretch and tighten over a framework that was actively, violently rearranging itself. Alan could see the muscles in his arms and legs spasming, thickening, swelling with a speed that was biologically obscene. It was a catastrophic systems failure of the human body, and Alan was watching it happen in real time. The sight was more terrifying than any monster from folklore. This was not the stuff of legends. It was pathology. It was a disease in its most aggressive, terrifying form. He was a doctor watching a patient in the throes of an agony he could not possibly treat. "My journals," Vance choked out, his voice already deepening, becoming more guttural. He pointed a trembling, elongating finger toward the workbench. "Everything is there. The sequence. The trigger protein." His body convulsed again, and a sickening wet crack echoed through the chamber as his shoulder blades dislocated and began to reform, broadening into powerful haunches. Coarse, steel-gray fur, the same fur Alan had found on the fence post, sprouted from his skin, pushing through the fabric of his lab coat. His face contorted, his jaw lengthening, his teeth pushing out from his gums. Through the agony, through the inhuman sounds tearing from his throat, Vance fought to retain control, to deliver one last piece of data. His eyes, now beginning to glow with a faint yellow light, locked onto Alan's. They were filled with a desperate, lucid plea. "This one is the last," he snarled, the words a terrible fusion of human speech and animal growl. "My research. Cognitive degradation. It becomes irreversible after this cycle. The man you are talking to will be gone. Only the hunger will remain." He was giving a prognosis, his own. Alan stood frozen, caught in a vortex of horror and clinical fascination. He could see it all through a surgeon's eyes. The radical hypertrophy of the muscle tissue, the restructuring of the skeletal framework, the rapid growth of keratin in the form of claws. He understood the colossal metabolic stress this was putting on the organism. The body was consuming itself to fuel the change. No tranquilizer dose could be calculated for this level of biological chaos. His science, his entire veterinary arsenal, was useless. Then Vance, with the last vestiges of his humanity, his face now a half-formed wolf's muzzle, did the unthinkable. He gestured with a hand that was now more of a paw, pointing directly at the revolver holstered on Alan's belt. "Kill me," the creature that was once Vance rasped. The voice was a deep, horrifying vibration that shook Alan to his core. "Please, Dr. West. It is the only cure that is left. Do not let me get out of this mine." It was the final request of a scientist, a plea for euthanasia from a man who had lost the war against his own biology. Alan looked at his own hands. In one he could picture the tranquilizer rifle, the symbol of his mission to capture, to study, to understand, the symbol of science and hope. On his hip, the cold, heavy weight of the revolver was a constant presence, a symbol of a final, brutal, merciful end. He was no longer a researcher facing an anomaly. He was a doctor, facing a terminal patient who was begging to be put down before he became a plague. The chamber echoed with a sound that was no longer human. It was a continuous, agonized roar, a symphony of pain, fury, and a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight in the cold air. The transformation was nearly complete. The being on the floor was a monstrous thing of corded muscle and thick gray fur, its limbs bent at impossible angles, its yellow eyes burning with a nascent feral light. The lab coat was in shreds, and the last recognizable feature of Dr. Elias Vance was gone, submerged beneath a tide of predatory biology. Alan's flashlight beam trembled, casting dancing, grotesque shadows on the stone walls. The controlled, rational world he had built around himself had been utterly demolished in the space of an hour. This moment was the terrible culmination of his entire life, a focal point of all his failures and fears. Once again, he stood before a terminal disease he could not cure. Once again, a life depended on his decision. The ghost of his daughter, Lily, stood beside him in the suffocating dark of the mine. He remembered the crushing helplessness he had felt by her hospital bed, the sterile beeps of the machines counting down the seconds of a life he was powerless to save. He had failed then because his science was not enough. Now, science was offering two impossible choices. He could still try. He could raise the tranquilizer rifle. He could fire the dart, pray his dosage calculation was close enough, and attempt to sedate the beast. It was the choice of the scientist, the choice to preserve the specimen for study. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that it was a fool's hope. The creature's metabolism was a raging chemical fire. The tranquilizer would fail, and in that failure, he would unleash an unthinking, 8-foot-tall killing machine on the unsuspecting world outside. The blood of its future victims would be on his hands. It would be a failure of catastrophic proportions. Or he could honor Vance's last wish. He could accept the other failure. He could become a killer. He could raise the revolver and end the suffering, end the threat, permanently. In doing so, he would destroy the only known subject of this condition. He would extinguish the one flickering light that might have led to an understanding or even a cure. He would be executing not just a monster, but a priceless, unique library of biological data. He would save the town, but he would fail humanity. He would become a hangman, not a healer. The creature on the floor let out a final shuddering groan, and its head lifted. For one fleeting, impossible second, its burning yellow eyes met Alan's, and in their depths, beneath the rage and the animal hunger, Alan saw it. A flicker of the man that was. A final silent plea for release. It was the look of a patient turning to his doctor for the only mercy left. That look broke him. His training, his ethics, his desperate need to understand, it all fell away, leaving only the stark, human reality of the situation. This was not a specimen. This was a man in his final, agonizing moments, begging for an end. With a movement that felt both infinitely slow and terrifyingly fast, Alan's hand bypassed the tranquilizer rifle. It went to his hip. His fingers, numb and clumsy, closed around the cold, checkered grip of the revolver. He drew the revolver. The weight of it was immense, a burden of finality. He raised the gun, the barrel heavy and unwavering as he brought it to bear. His finger found the trigger. Through the sights, he centered on the head of the thrashing, tormented creature that had been Dr. Elias Vance. He was a veterinarian. He knew where to place the shot for an instant, humane death. He met his patient's eyes one last time. He made his choice. A single deafening gunshot blasted through the mine, a sound absolute and irrevocable. It echoed down the dark, empty tunnels, a final, brutal period at the end of a terrifying sentence before being swallowed by the profound silence of the mountain.